Good morning, everyone. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes. All right, well, it's 9 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so my name is Carmen, and this is helping adult learners with low proficiency. And we're going to talk about some interventions and strategies. I know the information that most of you received talked about strategies for just reading and writing, but I went on ahead and included strategies for math as well, just because that's an area that students have some of the biggest struggles in. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you for taking time out on your Friday morning in the midst of all of this madness to do professional development. Just shows your true commitment to our adult learners, and I always appreciate that. So today we're going to talk about how to really understand. Oh, I'm sorry, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. So my company is Aspire Consulting and Educational Services. I feel like I should tell you who I am first, right? I've been doing professional development for adult literacy instructors for about 13 years now. And I really enjoy it. I feel like it's really important work because our adult learners have true learning needs that are often, that go unmatched. They were unmet in K-12, and then oftentimes in adult literacy programs, we obviously don't get the same kind of resources that K-12 receives, so it's always been very important work for me. I also work for Seeds of Literacy. I'm the Vice President of Programming. Seeds of Literacy is a nonprofit that provides adult literacy education area. We have 2 locations now, but we're hoping to expand to other places. We provide our services through the help of an amazing core of tutors. I'll talk about a couple of them and a couple of my staff members today while we're meeting. And just to give you some illustrations of some of these strategies at work. And so that's kind of my background. I've been in adult education for a long time. I really, really love it. I feel like it's why I'm on this planet. And in a second, I'm going to get to know a little bit about all of you. So we're going to talk about, first talk about who are these adults with low proficiency and what's important to know and understand about them. And after that, we'll talk about some general instructional strategies that you can use for low-level learners, and then we'll talk about strategies specific to reading, writing, and numeracy development, which is the math. Okay, so before we start, I want to give you a little tour. On your screen, this is actually go to meeting screen, but on your screen, there should be a box for chatting. If you can locate that box on your screen, on mine it's on the right side, yours will look a little bit different. If you can locate that screen, I will ask questions throughout the presentation. If you can just post your responses during that, if you have any questions, you can post those during the presentation, but also if you can put those responses, and that would be great. Okay, it looks like I see a hand raised. Vivi, if you can just, do you have a question? Vivi, is there a question? No, okay. So I'm going to ask a question now for you all to participate if you can. And the first question is just, how are you feeling today? Are you ready for this session? If you are the person who would say, not without my coffee, I'm not really up for this right now, then just go ahead and type an A in your chat box. And if you're the person who's like, yep, I'm ready, I'm raring to go, type a B in your chat box just to give it a shot so I can see that you guys are there and that you're able to find that function. All right, I see a couple B's popping in here. Can everyone find that? All right, so you should see the word chat, and next to the word chat is a little arrow, and if you click on that arrow, there will be a box that says type message here, and you should be able to type a message in there. All right, okay, so moving on, let's talk about understanding adults with low proficiency. So first, I want to get an idea of what does proficiency mean to all of us. Like, we all have different ideas of what it means to be highly proficient, or to have low proficient, or you might even say deproficient. So what does that mean to you? Are there folks in there who are willing to type in an answer for what proficiency means for them? okay? And if you're not in a typing kind of mood, that's fine. Just kind of think about, what does that mean for you? When you hear the word proficiency, what does that make you think of? Or when you hear of a learner with low proficiency, what does it make you think of? Okay, so I'm going to say that for me, there's proficiency is kind of, I try to think of it as a continuum. And so proficiency is when you have a high skill level at something. So if you're very proficient at math, then you have a high skill level at math. If you're very proficient in reading, you have a high skill level in reading. So someone who has high proficiency in the skill will be at the far right of this continuum over by high proficiency. And someone who has low skills in the area would be on the lower end of that, and that low proficiency continuum. But we are all on this continuum somewhere. And it changes based on what it is that we're engaging in. So for example, I'm a pretty good dancer. So my proficiency with dance is really, really high. But if I think about my proficiency with mechanical skills, my proficiency would be further to the left side of this low proficiency side of it. So if you think about yourself, what are some areas where your proficiency would be high? What are some things that maybe you're very good at cooking, or maybe you're very good at reading, maybe you're a skilled teacher. So what are some of the areas where your proficiency is high? I remember doing a workshop a couple years ago in Florida, and I asked this question, what are the areas where you're high? And everybody was really eager to participate in that question. And then I went to the next slide and I asked, so where are the areas where your proficiencies are low? And this woman said, I don't do things that I'm not proficient in now that I'm an adult, which is good that most of us get to choose that. Unfortunately, our learners don't have that opportunity. So I see organizing, I see budgeting, I see cooking. Those are actually all things that I think are areas of high proficiency for me as well. All right, so we all have areas where we're really, really good at something, areas that we, just really excel, things that just come easy for us. So the other side of that spectrum, what areas is your proficiency low? So again, for me, mine would be like technology, anything mechanical. Those things just don't kind of click for me. I will tinker with some things, but I don't have a high expectation of what the outcome's going to be when I'm tinkering with those things. Okay, so no matter what your responses are, everyone has something that we're very, very high in areas where we're very, very low. And our students are no different. The difference with our students is the areas where their proficiency is low are the areas where we put all the chips. Everything matters in those areas. So they may be very proficient at other skills, skills that allow them to have an income even with low literacy levels, but those aren't the skills that we reward in our society. So I want us to just kind of keep that context in mind. And so I want to ask, do you think the proficiency is the same as intelligence? Would you say that proficiency is the same as intelligence? I'll give you just a couple seconds to think about that question. Okay, so a lot of folks will say yes, they think that proficiency and intelligence are the same, but proficiency and intelligence actually are not the same. And I think that that's an important distinction to make with our students. So intelligence is actually the ability to acquire skill. And most of our students do have the ability to acquire the skills that they want. They just haven't had a lot of successful experiences with them, but they do have the intelligence to acquire the skill. But the proficiency is they can't demonstrate a high level of performance. So because a student isn't performing well, doesn't mean they don't have the intelligence to perform well. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. And I also think it's important to make that distinction with our students, because often they have also kind of bought into the idea that they're not intelligent because of the experience, because they've had experiences with academic failure. So sometimes you have to convince them. And actually, what I see a lot of time at Seeds, we will serve any student, whether they're unable to read or if they're pretty proficient in reading. So if they're a beginning reader, one of the first things that I notice about those students is that they spend probably their first 15 minutes trying to convince me that they're intelligent. Well, you don't have to convince me that you're intelligent. I know that you're intelligent. You're not proficient in these lower level skills because someone missed the mark along the way. So we'll get to that in a moment. I think it's just really important to make the distinction that proficiency is not the same thing as intelligence. You can have a student who's very, very intelligent, but just not proficient in academic skills. And so our goal is to try to help them to get to the point where they are more proficient. So how does that happen? How do we get to where we have adults who are not proficient in reading, not proficient in writing, or not proficient in math? And there are a couple of reasons for that. And I feel like it's important to spend a little time here because we tend to, there's a book called Is Everyone Really Equal by Robin DiAngelo. And she co-wrote it with someone whose last name is Sensoy. And in the book, they talk about inequality. And one of the things that they talk about is that where we locate social problems determines our response to social problems. So if we look at a social problem as being, if we look at illiteracy as being an individual's problem because of their own failure, we're more likely to be hands off and say, okay, well, you need to figure out how to fix your issue. But if we see that this is a problem that's created systemically, then we have more of a responsibility corporately to say, hey, let's put a hand in here. So I like to explain the reasons because a lot of students will blame themselves even after I talk to them about what some of the other reasons are for, like some of the systemic reasons that results in school failure. They'll still try to explain to me why they are to blame for it because they've accepted it. They've been told it for such a long time. But there are a lot of reasons that are out of a student's control. So I want you to think about the fact that in our schools, we often say that kids in kindergarten through first, second, and third grade learn to read. We hear on the news that they talk about the third grade reading guarantee, which means that if students aren't reading on grade level by third grade, then we're going to do some things to intervene because we know that that third grade level is a predictor for their future as a reader. We do not have a system in this country really for helping those third graders. So when you have an adult in front of you who's struggling with basic math facts, who's struggling with reading, who has difficulty writing a sentence, it means that when that kid was 7 or 8, no one intervened to help them. So to blame an adult for something that someone didn't do when they were younger is a little bit ridiculous, right? So for example, if I broke my arm when I was 7, if I have limited mobility in my arm now, you would be like, well, what happened to her doctor? Where were her parents? You wouldn't blame the child. You wouldn't blame me as an adult for what didn't happen as a child, but we do that with our adult learners. So I just have to put that out there. Our schools are really just not meant to help every student. Our classes are too big, despite, I come from a family teachers. A lot of my friends are teachers, and despite their best efforts, there's just no way with one teacher and 25 to 30 kids in a class, you're going to be able to get every student to learn everything at the same time. It just isn't possible, but our schools are still set up so that as though that it works that way. The other thing is sometimes we jump teaching philosophy. So phonics was working in one decade and everybody was doing phonics, and somebody published a paper or wrote a book that said, we're going to use whole language, and then everybody dropped phonics and went to whole language. So if you're one of those kids who gets kind of caught between those different movements, you may have one teacher who believes in one philosophy and get to the next school the next year before you have really mastered it, and they're moving you on to something different. And so you have students who have lots of holes through no fault of their own. Not to mention that there may be instabilities in the schools with a teacher leaving or going on maternity leave or all kinds of things that can happen. Then there are their home lives, which also, if you're thinking about a young child, they're also not under their control. So sometimes there's lots of stress in the home. It can be a lot worse for homes that have housing or food instability. If there are homes with trauma and violence, there's a lot of research out now that talks about how trauma actually changes the brain and negatively impacts learning. My Cleveland State students this semester read a book called Do I Dare Disturb the Universe by a woman named Charlize Lyles. She's a Clevelander. She grew up in the King Kennedy projects in the Central neighborhood, and she was chosen to be in a program called A Better Chance, which allowed her an opportunity to do her high school years at Hawken. And so she had this experience of being in a very, very low income area, very under-resourced schools, to being at a school where they had cows in a barn on site. And she talks about how the trauma that she experienced in her childhood from seeing someone, an ice cream man, murdered outside of her housing complex, to any number of things, that when she would feel that in school, when she would think about those things and those memories would intrude, she would just daydream. And she would daydream so much that her teachers put her in special education, even though she actually ended up being a gifted student and a pretty prolific writer. So just there's so many things that can be happening to a kid in the school, in the home, that's completely out of their control. And if no one intervenes when they're 7, 8, 9 years old, those kids are on a path to become the adult learners that we serve. So the adult learners who we have, they're there for reasons that really had nothing to do with them. So I really want to just kind of stress that a little bit. Another reason is that even though it's a lot easier to standardize education, we know that each learner is different. We know that each teacher, each tutor is different. For one thing, the age that students come to school is very different. Some kids start school the day they turn 5. Some kids have been 5 for a year. So in terms of development, they're in very different places. The information that they bring into school is different. Some kids may have been to zoos and museums and science centers and all of those and have traveled extensively, and other kids have not. So their funds of knowledge will be a little bit different. How often they attend school. Absenteeism is a problem, particularly in lower income areas. So that could also be a factor. If they're mentally present when they are physically in school, to use the example of Charlize Lyles and her daydreaming to deal with her trauma. And then also the learning styles. Our brains are just very different. Some of us, the visual areas of our brain are a lot more active for us. Some of us, the movement areas, the motor areas are a lot more active for us. So there are so many different things that impact how we learn, but we teach the same way to a bunch of students at one time, and it's just not an effective way. So any number of these school factors, home factors, individual learning factors, any number of those things, and every combination of those things can leave a kid with a faulty foundation for learning. And if no one has the time to firm up that foundation when kids are young, then they'll become adults who struggle with literacy. And that's how we get them, okay? So, so let's talk about some general strategies for helping learners who are kind of on the lower end of the proficiency spectrum. And the first thing that I'll say is, and I mean this sincerely, even though this is like a 2-hour presentation, if you don't remember anything else that I say, if you only hear 2 things that I say today, I think these are the 2 most important things. And I'll tell you what they are, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail with them. The first thing is, the most important information you will ever have is knowledge of your students' thinking. I'll repeat that. The most important information you will ever have is knowledge of your students' thinking. So how is your student thinking about the topic that you're working on right now? How are they thinking about the activity that you're doing? Their thinking is the key to everything, and I'll explain why in just a second. The second thing that I really want you to remember is, one of the most effective tools that you have all of this technology at your fingertips, you have all of these materials at your fingertips, but the most important, the most effective tool that you have in your arsenal is your own thought process. And I'll explain why that is in a moment. Okay, so important thing number 1, let's go into a little bit more detail about that. So when I first started teaching adult literacy, I was teaching in a classroom setting. It was me and like 25 students. There were different students every week. So every week I got 2 or 3 new students. It was really kind of crazy trying to manage that. And so whenever I would start a lesson, one of the first things I would do is I would ask the students, because I would do like whole group lessons and then small group lessons and then one-on-one work with my students. In my whole group lessons, which were typically around math and writing, which were the things that my students struggled with the most, I would always ask, what do you know about this topic first? Like, tell me what you already know. Number 1, I felt like it got the students to kind of focus on the subject that we were going to be talking. That's actually called an anticipatory set in education. So I get them talking about what it is that we were going to be working on, or I would get them doing like some kind of activity around what we were going to be learning. But one of the first things I wanted to know is, what do you already know or think or believe about this topic? Because I wanted to find out if there were any misconceptions, if there were any, like what they already knew, what I didn't need to teach, or what were their big holes, where do I start with this content? So knowing what they think is really important. So on the day that I was teaching the order of operations, which for those of you who are just like, oh, please don't bring math into my life, order of operations is how we solve math problems so that we consistently get the right answer. So we could all look at this math problem and solve it and get two completely different answers. Some of us would get 18, some of us would get 2, a couple people get something different probably. But the order of operations tells us that we should follow parentheses and then solve what's in the parentheses, then any exponents, then multiply and divide from left to right, and then add and subtract from left to right. Well, a popular tool that teachers will use are mnemonics, such as PEMDAS or PEMDAS. Some teachers will take it a little bit further and give students a little sentence to help them to remember. And the sentence that we typically teach is, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, because it teaches students to do the parentheses, please excuse exponents, my, multiply, dear, divide, Aunt Sally, addition, and subtraction. So when I ask my students, how many of you remember the order of operations? One of my students was super, super eager. Oh, Ms. Carmen, I know. And I said, okay, great. What is it? And she says, ain't that please excuse my sister Mary thing, right? So it was wonderful, right? But that taught me that, number one, she had been exposed to the order of operations before, and this wasn't something that was brand new for everybody. Some of my students had some familiarity. It also taught me that she had confused the acronym, but it taught me that then I needed to make that correction. So sometimes what we start out with, like, oh, here's the beginning, and then here's the middle, and then here's the end, which I typically support. But I think with adult learners, you have to ask them first, where is your beginning? What do you know already? Because a lot of times it'll bring up some misconceptions that you didn't even know the student had and didn't know that you were working against. So if we do all of the talking with our students, then sometimes it doesn't give us a chance for them to speak up, and it doesn't give us a chance to see what it is that they're thinking. So if a student is doing a math problem, for example, and let's say they're doing the problem on their own and silently, and they keep coming up with the wrong answer, you have no idea what's going on in their mind. But if the student is talking out loud and telling you what's in their brain and what their thinking is, you can see that, oh, you're forgetting to carry. So you're carrying, but you're forgetting to add that in to your product, right? So when the student makes what they're doing visible, when their thinking is visible, when we ask, what do you know, what do you understand, it makes it a lot easier for them. It makes it a lot easier for us to know that, oh, that's why you don't get it, and here's how I can help you. So it's a way to kind of cut through some of the trouble. Okay, and so the second most important thing, one of the most effective tools that you have in your arsenal is your thought process. There are so many things that we know in our minds. There are so many things that we do when we read, when we do math. There are so many strategies that we use that are just, we're so used to doing them that they're invisible to us. We don't even see them anymore. And our students need us to make the invisible visible. They need us to narrate our thought process because they haven't learned to think in that same way. So it makes me think of being younger and spending time with older people in my family and listening to them talk about politics or faith or finances or whatever, and or even relationships, and then just listening to how they thought about things differently than I did because they had some maturity, they had some experience, they had some wisdom. But the more I started spending time around them, or I noticed that when I spent time around them, it would make me think a little bit differently too, right? Or you ever spend time with somebody who's just like really super intelligent, and when you leave them, you feel smarter too because of the way that you're starting to process things? That's exactly what we need to do for our students and model our processes for them. So the process of listening to older people, of being under someone's tutelage, of having a mentor, is that they start to teach you their process. They start to teach you how to think critically and analytically, how to think mathematically in the way that we do. Our students, if they separated from school before we really started that, say before middle school or even before high school, they may not have developed those skills. So those skills are not going to be in any GED book, really, for the most part. Those skills are going to be things that you do that, well, you know what, when I get to this problem, this is how I look at it. That can be very helpful. So if you start out by asking the student, what do you think and understand? and then can say, well, you know what, this is how I do it. If you don't have anything else, those are the two things that I even find in my own practice that I use more than anything. How do you see this? Okay, here's how I see it. And then that's the way for, honestly, for the students to be the part of the teacher and for me to be the part of the teacher. I'm going to brag about one of my colleagues. I don't know if she's on the call. I did not ask for her permission. She would kill me, actually. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about Kara Kraviak, who I work with at Seeds of Literacy, because I think that she runs a book club with our students on Wednesdays. She's actually planning to do kind of a book club, even virtually, with our students during our closure. But the thing about that book club that I think is the most phenomenal thing is that first of all, she gets the students reading things that they typically would not be reading. There are also things that are helping to prepare them for the types of language that they're going to encounter on the high school equivalency test. But I think more than anything, what she does is she models how to analyze literature, how to analyze text, how to think about it. And if you attend the book club, you start to hear the students responding to those questions and then eventually asking those questions. So what she's doing is she's helping to think about their thinking, and she's helping them to develop their thinking, which is just using what she does when she reads. And it's a marvelous, marvelous thing. If you ever get a chance to come and visit us on Wednesdays at 11, the book club is a great place to start. So include that in your tour. But basically, if you share those strategies that you use, if you share the processes that you use, you teach the students to develop those tools as well. So if you don't remember anything else, remember that it's important to know what the students are thinking, and it's also very important to be able to explain to them what you're thinking, to make the invisible visible for them. Okay, so here are another here are a couple of other general tips. So first, be sure to check for their current level of knowledge. So be sure to do that, and then try to avoid assuming prior knowledge or understanding. So I know that sounds like, okay, Carmen, what am I supposed to, you want me to check for their current level and not assume that they know other stuff, right? So sometimes we'll say things like, well, they're adults, so I'm sure they understand division. Well, you know, there are adults who don't understand division. So it's better to just ask, so what do you know about this topic? Tell me what you know about fractions, or talk to me about alliteration, or tell me about what is the main idea. How would you explain main idea to your 7-year-old sister? So check for the student's current level of understanding, and then try to avoid assuming prior knowledge and understanding. The second set, I'm giving these kind of in pairs. Be sure to give students time to put their thoughts in words, and try to avoid filling in those uncomfortable silences. So sometimes we'll say, so does anyone remember anything about the order of operations? And then we have 2 seconds of silence to get nervous, and we feel like we have to fill it. Well, sometimes you have to just give the student an opportunity to think about what it is that they know and understand. Visual learners, especially, visual learners think in pictures. So when they're processing something, they take those pictures and they turn them in, or they take the words that they're learning and they turn them into pictures, and they store them in pictures in their minds. So then when they need them again, they need to go back and retrieve those pictures and translate them back into words. And so sometimes they just need a minute. So give them a little space to think about it. And it's okay. You know, you can say, take your time, I'm just going to wait, and then give them a moment. Okay. So the other thing is to scaffold. So where you see on my slides that I've highlighted certain tips, those are tips I'm going to go into a little bit greater detail. So I'm going to talk about scaffolding in a little bit greater detail in a moment. And then try to avoid doing all of the work for the student, because I've seen people working with students where they're like, well, you just do this, and then you do this, and you do this, and you do that, and the student is still like, I still have no idea what it is that I'm doing. So let's talk a little bit about scaffolding. Okay, so scaffolding is basically a process where you provide more support for the student as you go. You provide a lot of support for the student in the beginning, and then as the student starts to gain more skills, you gradually pull that away. So the first step of scaffolding is when you're kind of the sage on the stage and you're talking, you're telling the student what it is that you want them to know or understand. So at Seeds, we say, I do, you watch, you do, I talk through it, and then you do on your own. So we kind of like try to build the student up to where they're able to do more. Typically what I do is I'll start out by explaining something to a student, like I'll figure out what it is that they know and understand. And then I'll start explaining something to them. And then I'll show them how to do something the first time through. So the first time through, I'm going to talk through what I'm doing, every single step, and I'm going to show them what I'm doing. The next step, I may do it, but have them talk through it. The next step, they'll do it, and I'll just kind of chip in every time if it feels like they're getting stuck. And then the last time, they'll do it independently. And so you're giving students just the amount of support that they need to get to where they need to get to. So it's basically like helping them and then removing a little bit of help and then removing a little bit of help and then really removing a little bit of help. So just a little bit more of an explanation of what that scaffolding is. So which one of these general tips like thinking of the general tips, checking for students' current level of understanding, not assuming prior knowledge, trying not to feel uncomfortable silences, giving them time to put their thoughts into words, scaffolding or withdrawing support. Which one of those tips do you think you might find useful? I'll go back to that slide really quickly. Think about any of these tips that you think might be useful for, well, actually, I already know the answer to this one. You don't even need to type this in, because the tips that you're going to find the most useful, the ones that you're going to implement, will be these two important things. You're going to ask students, what do they actually understand? And then you're going to start by explaining what you know and telling them what it is that you do and sharing, making your invisible visible. So I was gonna, I wanted to pause for general questions, but I think I'm gonna keep going, because it looks like, it doesn't look like there are a lot of people. Christine's asking me if I can edit my name from Lori's to yours. When we break, we're going to take a quick screen break in a little bit. When we do that screen break, I'll do that right now. I do not know how to do that, so I'm going to leave that alone. So, oh, yes, I can. Okay. So my name is Carmen. I hope you all can see that. I don't know if that fixed it or not, but anyway, I gave it a shot. So it looks like I wanted to try to pause and ask questions in between so that you all would have an opportunity to ask at that moment, because I know that if we go like another hour, you may have forgotten a question, but it doesn't look like too many people are using the chat feature. I'm not sure if you all aren't finding it easily or if you just aren't feeling it today, but so I'm going to go ahead, unless Christine, you can think of any questions that you think aren't clear at the moment. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead to the next one. We may get out a little bit early. I tried to leave room for participation, but since there isn't a whole lot of it, I don't have to count for that time. So I was going to give us a break now, but I'm going to keep going because we're only a quarter of the way through, okay? After the strategies for reading, I will actually take a real break, okay? So, all right, so this is the one I'm probably going to get the most excited about because reading is my thing. So we're going to talk about some reading strategies, and I picked 7, and they're actually so many, but I picked 7 that I thought would be easy to implement, easy to understand, things that some of them may be things that you do just organically, naturally. As you can see, there are 2 areas that I want to spend a little bit more time on, putting fluency first and the KWL. So I won't explain those 2 now, but know that those 2 are coming, okay? So the second strategy, so the first strategy is putting fluency first, and we'll talk about what fluency is in just a moment. The second thing is defining vocabulary. And the defining vocabulary is so important because if you think about it, like one of the things that I used to do for my students is I would give them a passage that we were going to work on the next day. So let's say I was giving them a passage about the Civil War. I would pass out those readings to the students in the evening before they left, and I would ask them to take a highlighter and just highlight any words that they didn't know. And I would look to see, I mean, you have to look at the color and see who knew the most words and who had who knew the most words on their own and who had the most words that they needed to learn to be able to understand that content. Particularly in the content areas, vocabulary is the concept that students need to understand. So if they're really struggling with the vocabulary, they're going to struggle with the concept and understanding what it is that you're trying to get them to know. If a student doesn't understand what democracy is or partisanship is, the whole conversation around parties, political parties, would be lost. They need to understand those key concepts. So we want to define vocabulary for them, but define it in a way that they'll understand it. So for me, giving a student a definition isn't just saying, well, here's what this means, but giving them a definition, maybe giving them an example, and also giving them a non-example. So I might say, well, partisanship is when a society has political parties that kind of run their system, and partisanship is when you focus on what you do for your party versus what's actually good for the country. So I would say an example of partisanship would be if I, only tried to register voters who align with my political beliefs. And a non-example would be, maybe some of the efforts towards fighting this coronavirus. We're not thinking about parties, we're thinking about how to help people. So giving them a definition, giving them an example, giving them a non-example, helping them to put that vocabulary in their own words. If they just write the dictionary definition, sometimes the dictionary definition is so obscure that it's not really helpful. So giving them a real definition so that they understand that. So focusing on vocabulary first, because if I give a student a passage and say, hey, can you highlight the words that you don't know? And they highlight 10 to 15% of the words on that page, that means that they're only going to go away at best with 85% of an understanding. And if those vocabulary words are related to the concepts that they need to understand, that percentage of understanding will get smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's very important to focus on vocabulary, particularly in the subject areas. Definitely in math, even though people don't tend to focus on math vocabulary, it really is important to focus on even the smallest concepts. I was working with a student recently, and she's trying to prepare for the Armed Services Vocational Assessment Battery, the ASVAB test that you have to take to get into the military. And her math skills are super, super low. Her number sense, her understanding of math is really, really low. And so we were talking about addition and subtraction and how to help her learn her math facts better. And one of the things that I said to her is, so can we talk about what happens if you add any number to 0? And so we talked about the identity property of addition, that anytime a number looks in the mirror and there's a 0 on the other side of that plus sign, they're going to see themselves in the reflection, right? So 8 plus 0 will be 8, 1,000 plus 0 will be 1,000. So we talked about that, and then we talked about how when you're adding, if you're adding anything plus 1, the next number, your answer is going to be the next counting number. So if I add 2 plus 1, the next counting number is 3. So just an easy way for her to kind of grab onto those, some of those math facts. So when we were talking about adding by 2s, I said, so let's talk about even and odd numbers. And I said, because if you know your even and odd numbers, if you can count your even and odd numbers kind of easily, it makes it a lot easier to remember how to add by 2s. And I said, so let's talk about even and odd numbers. And then she said, so how do I know when a number is even or when a number is odd? And I knew that, I asked the question so I could get to what her understanding of it was, but I was still a little bit surprised that even and odd was a concept that a 29-year-old woman who's been, living her life still had struggles with. So it's really important to make sure that we don't take that for granted. The third one would be checking for understanding. Checking for understanding and reading. Sometimes you'll have a student who will work through a whole entire passage or a whole entire worksheet, and they'll go through and they'll answer the questions, and then you say, well, what was this about? And they can't give you any idea of what it's about. Part of the reason for that is, again, if students are struggling with reading in the 2nd and 3rd grade, there's no time for them to catch up. And because there's no time for them to catch up, they start developing strategies. And they have some of the most effective coping mechanisms I've ever seen in my life. But students become really good at guessing. So they'll see THR at the beginning of the word, and they're going to guess that it's either through or thought or thou or thorough or anything super close to that. And so they do a lot of that filling in the gaps. And if you're doing that, there's a lot of stuff that you're going to miss because your comprehension is not going to be complete if there are holes in that vocabulary. So what ends up happening is students get to the end of a passage and they don't understand what it is that they've read. So instead of allowing a student to go super far, check for their understanding and get them to check for understanding every paragraph or so. Going back to the rule that I said before, that we make our invisible visible. When we read, if we read something, and I won't speak for all of us, but let's say when I read, if I read something, at the end of the paragraph, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not sure I quite got that. Let me go back, and I'll go back and I'll read it again, particularly if I'm reading statistics or research. I use lots of statistical methods in them. So then I have to go back and I read it again. I don't wait until I get to the end of the entire 15-page article and go, I have no idea what I've read. I'm checking for understanding the entire way through. So getting students to check for understanding. And there are a couple different ways that you can do that. So for one thing that I'll do is I'll ask students to tell me what is the big idea of this paragraph, like what is the main idea. So one thing that I'll do is say, okay, so after you read these 4 or 5 sentences, I want you to tell me what's the most important thing the author wants me to know about this topic. And so they'll read through and I'll say, okay, great. So what is the most important thing? And if they can help me find the most important thing, then that's great. And if they can't, then I'll try to help them figure out what's important. So we may read through sentence by sentence and say, is this the most important thing? Is this the most important thing? Is this the most important thing? And then what I'll do is I'll get them to highlight what in the passage made them think that that sentence was the most important thing. And so as we're going through a passage, every paragraph, they have that highlighted sentence. Or I might ask them to say, can you summarize that sentence in 4 or 5 words? So maybe the sentence is, Americans consume tons of food. And maybe that's the whole gist of the first paragraph. So Americans consume lots of food. Can you summarize that in 4 or 5 words? What those 4 or 5 word summaries do is it allows the student to then go back and read their 4 or 5 word summaries and remember what the entire passage or exercise was about. So getting students to check for understanding and write little notes, or check for understanding and figure out and highlight the big idea, is a tool that can help them with that comprehension. I use that skill all the time. If you look at, when I was younger, my mom wouldn't let us write in books. And so the first time that someone told me to highlight something, I was like, oh, but let me tell you, my books look like, Lord have mercy. Because I annotate and I write notes and I ask questions in the margins, or a lot of times I'll go back to things so that I can incorporate them with other students. And so I don't want to reread every book that I've ever read. These little 3 or 4 word summaries allow me to go back to that book and read my little summaries in the margins, and I can finish the whole book in, just a little bit of time. So I try to use that strategy that I use for myself with my students. Don't wait until you get to the end to check for understanding. Check your understanding all along, and then give yourself a little clue with your 4 or 5 word summary. Now, back to highlighting the main idea. One thing that I think is really nice is once the students have gotten in the habit of highlighting the main idea, you can go back to that passage and say, do you see any patterns in this reading? And what typically will happen is they'll notice that the most important sentence is usually the first or second sentence. And that's really helpful in instruction because that's a teachable moment. You can show them that then, yes, when you're writing, you want to make your most important sentence first. And when you're reading, excuse me, if you're reading and you want to skim that first 1 or 2 sentences can be really helpful. So it's another strategy that you're giving them that maybe no one has taught them in the time that they separated from school. So helping them to learn to check for understanding can be really helpful. Another tool that I like to use in checking for understanding is just the 5 W's. Okay, it's particularly if they're reading a story. So who is the main character, and what is happening in this story, and where is it located, and what time period did this occur in? Like getting them to answer questions about just the basic questions can get them to start focusing their attention as they're reading on comprehension. So then after checking for understanding, there is using visual tools. So again, a lot of our students are very visual in their learning. Visual learners often speak visually, so they'll say things like, oh, I see what you mean, or I can't picture that, right? So those are the students who really are aided by images. So if they have tools like graphs or diagrams or drawings, it can really help them because they're able to, when they make memories, they make their memories visually. So if they have an image or a diagram that they can connect to, a lot of times that will help those students with their memory. Also for your learners who are kinesthetic, who need to move and touch and feel things, Sometimes even drawings help them too, because the act of tracing what it is that they're doing can again, it helps to create a neural pathway in their brain. I won't go down that rabbit hole. So for example, if I was doing, like, one of the things that I used to do with my students is whenever I would teach science, I would teach the human body systems together, and then I would have a diagram. And so they would just have a picture of a human body, and they would have to, it didn't have to be exact, but they'd have to draw that this is where food comes in, and this is where it goes next, and this is where it comes out, and this is where the, like, one of the things that we highlighted was all of our systems bring good things through the body and remove bad things from the body. And I wanted them to see that in every single system, that pattern is repeated. Good stuff comes in, bad stuff comes out. Food comes in and nutrients come in, waste goes out, and at the cellular level and the food level. Oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide goes out. So just really helping them to understand that these systems work very similarly. It makes it a lot easier to understand when you combine it that way, when you chunk it that way. But I would have them draw pictures of where their heart is and where the brain is and where the lymph nodes are and where the reproductive glands are, like all of that stuff, because I wanted them to be able to visualize it. I want them to have an understanding of where things were and how they worked. But I also knew that some of my learners were just going to be very visual learners, and that would make it so much easier for them if they could see what it is that they were learning. Number 5, make moving a learning experience. Again, sometimes students just are very, their learning is very embodied, and things that they do physically, if they either try it themselves or they go through the motions even, it can really help them. So I had a tutor once talk about a student because he still counted on his fingers when he was doing math, and she was like, he's too old to be counting on his fingers. I'm like, if counting on his fingers helps him, you know, give him 10 more. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, if it's helping him, if it's working for him, don't try to take it away from him. Some people are just very kinesthetic in their learning, and they need that touch. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like, you don't have to have them going through the movement of, say, you know, the Civil War. You could say there was a Union and there was a Confederacy, and you can show them, you know, make them think about there was this, and that, because it helps them to physically start encoding the information. And one of the things that they find is that when they do brain scans of students when they're learning, if they learn, like, so when you do a brain scan of someone reading the word lick, the area that actually moves their tongue is also activated, because our movement is actually connected to our cognition, but a lot of times we don't use the advantage of that. So even if you're trying to get students to remember the PEMDAS, parentheses, exponents, multiply, divide, add, subtract, it doesn't necessarily have to be related. It can just be movement to go with what they're learning, and that can help them encode it. So make moving a learning experience. Excuse me, that can also mean using physical things in class, using real life tasks in class. If I want to talk to students about measurement, it's a lot easier talking about measurement if they have a ruler in their hands. If we're talking about, you know, if we're talking about baking or something, it might actually be helpful to have some of that stuff in the classroom. So making learning a moving experience. Using text structure, which I also think is important. So sometimes students, you know, so sometimes the structure will say, like, you'll be reading a story and you'll start to realize that this story is about cause and effect. It's helpful for students to pay attention to that, the fact that this is cause and effect, because it gets them to focus their attention on what it is that they're learning. So if they know that this is a cause and effect story structure, then they know that something's happening and they're waiting for the effect. So they're looking for it. It's basically like they're anticipating, they're looking for the answer. It's almost like, you know how if you pre-read the questions before you fill out, before you read something, it's just like you're trying to focus your attention, which is also a good strategy, getting students to pre-read questions before they begin reading. It focuses their attention on what it is that they're looking for. And so that same thing happens with the text structure. There's also the compare and contrast text structure, which allows students to know that they're looking at how two things are alike and how two things are different. There's a description frame, which basically tells us, like, that I'm describing this thing in greater detail. I may be giving facts or opinions or descriptions, but that students understand that, oh, I'm just learning about this one thing. And then there's the time order. So using a text, the time order, which tells students that something happened in a sequence. So all of those frames can help students organize their information Knowing the frame can also help students organize their notes. If I'm doing a compare and contrast, if I'm reading something that's compare and contrast, my notes will look like one thing on one side and one thing on the other side, and I'll look at how they're alike and I'll look at how they're different. So use the text structure as a tool to help students with comprehension as well. So now we'll get to putting fluency first in the KWL. KWL is my very favorite thing. If you've ever been in one of my workshops before, you've seen it. So reading has 5 components actually. And we focus mostly on comprehension just because our materials focus mostly on comprehension. So students get a passage and then they're asked to answer questions about that passage. So we've already talked actually a little bit about vocabulary, and I'm starting from the bottom for a reason. Comprehension, we all know. Do you understand what it is that you're reading? Vocabulary, again, we've talked about already. Do you understand what the words mean? Because the word meaning helps to facilitate overall meaning. Fluency is, if a student is a fluent reader, then if you hear them read out loud, it sounds like the pace of conversational speech. It's very important for students to read fluently, because if they don't read fluently, then they cannot get to comprehension, or comprehension is very, very difficult with fluency. So typically if a student is not fluent, they read very, very slowly. Their reading is pretty choppy. They can't read as many words as you would expect someone to read at their level of proficiency. And what that means is, for one, if they don't read quickly enough, they may not have time to complete the high school equivalency tests, which are timed. So if a student reads really, really slowly for their proficiency level, then they're probably not going to be able to finish their test in time. So they'll fail, not because they don't have the intelligence, but because they just don't read quickly enough. If a student isn't fluent, it could be because they don't, by the time they get to the end of their passage, their brain is so focused on understanding the individual words that by the time they get to the end of the passage, they don't remember what they've read. They haven't connected the meaning because they've been focusing on individual word identification and individual word meaning. So if a student isn't reading fluently, then comprehension isn't really appropriate. So if you're working with a student who doesn't have comprehension, you really need to stop and focus on fluency, which means that that student should be doing repeated oral readings and practicing how to read more proficiently. If a student's not reading proficiently, it's probably because of numbers 1 and 2. Number 2 is phonics. And phonics is basically just the rules for how we combine the sounds of our language. So knowing when a vowel should be long and when a vowel should be short. Knowing when a G should be a G sound and when a G should be a J sound. So that's phonics. So phonics is knowing how the sounds of our language are combined. Phonics is knowing that an AY, like at the end of hey, is the A sound, and knowing that EIGH at the end of way is an A sound. So that's phonics, is knowing how all those different combinations of sounds work together. And if a student struggles with phonics, they're going to struggle with fluency as well, because when they get to a word that they don't know or recognize, they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to approach it. Often what I see is students will either just throw in a word that they think it might be, or they skip it altogether like it's not even there. So if a student is struggling with fluency, they're going to struggle with comprehension. And if they're struggling with fluency, it could be because they need to work on their phonics. And then phonemic awareness is the beginning level, which is where students begin to identify that each one of the letters of our alphabet can represent at least one sound. And so if a student has phonemic awareness, they know what the consonants are and what the consonant sounds are. And sometimes students need to even work on developing that. So those are the 5 components of reading, but focus on fluency. If you have a student and they read for you and it doesn't sound like the pace of conversational speech, asking them to do comprehension tasks is really asking them too much, and you need to pull back and focus on fluency a little bit. And then last, for the reading, what components of reading do you, well, most programs focus on comprehension. I've already said that because we're not really doing participation. So I'm going to talk about KWL. And so KWL stands for know, want to know, and learn. And so this is a way that I like to get students to organize their notes, in fact. So if we're going to be talking about a new topic, I'll ask a student, can you focus on, can you split your paper in three columns? K, W, L. K is the column for what you already know about this topic. W is the topic for what you want to know about this topic. And L is for what you learned about the topic. So then as they start learning new facts or new information, then they'll start writing in notes in that column. As they start answering the questions in the want to know column, they'll start filling that in the L column. And then what happens is that L column becomes a way for them to just review the content that they've learned. And I really, really love this tool, and it really, really is a lot of fun. And it's also a very, very good way to figure out what a student understands. It's also a very good way to figure out what a student already understands. So for example, if we're doing a lesson on the Civil War, I may ask, well, what do you guys already know about the Civil War? And they'll just start throwing in facts. And so if they throw up a fact that is actually a fact, I'll say, okay, we know that the Civil War was between the North and the South, and we'll put that up. And so sometimes we do this as an individual activity. I think it's fun to do it as a group activity. So then I'll ask, so maybe while we're throwing out what we know, a student might say, well, I know that the South was the Confederate. No, I think the North. So we don't know that. So then we'll put that in a what we want to know column. Which one was the Union? Which one was the Confederacy? Some student might say, well, it was because of slavery. And somebody might say, well, no, it wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights, or it was about this, or it was about that. Then those become questions that we seek to answer. So then when students are working on that, when we're reading through materials, we are reading through materials with these questions in mind. So now we have a focus and a purpose for the reading, which can also make it a little bit easier. And then again, students will write in the learn column what they've learned. And it's a really good way for them to go back and review that. So the war started here, whatever. And so it gives them an opportunity to kind of take what they're learning and put it into a formal format. So that is the end of the reading section. I'm going to go back really quickly and just review really quickly. So the strategies are to focus on fluency, to make sure you're defining vocabulary, to check for understanding, to use visual tools, to try to make learning visual for the students, to also make it physical, to give them opportunities to move, to use the text structures like cause and effect, compare and contrast, description, time, order, etc. And then also to think about having students take notes in the KWL format. If you use the KWL, you already are doing that one first important thing I told you. If you don't remember anything else, is to find out what students' understanding is. That K gives you an opportunity to do that really quickly and easily. And it's actually kind of fun for them to start thinking like, I know this, or I know this, or I know that. All right, so now I'd like to take a quick break. If you all don't mind, we'll just take 5 minutes. We'll go away. We'll come back and we'll get started. And we'll talk about writing strategies. We'll talk about numeracy strategies. And then I guess we can open the mics so that if people have questions at the end, they can ask them. I would really, really love it, though, if people could use the chat feature. It makes it a lot easier for me to see. Makes it a lot easier for me to see what it is that you're doing. So let's take 5 minutes. And then we'll come back. I'm going to set a little timer, and then as soon as that timer goes off, we'll start again. Okay? All righty. Okay. I'm going to turn off my camera for just a second, too.
Hi, Candace?
Carmen?
Carmen, hi.
Hi.
I'm one of the participants in Philby. I can't access typing in the chat. I don't know if it's a systematic problem or not, but I can type in question. It gives me the blank to type in, but I'm in chat now and there's nowhere for me to type. The only one I can see are some from Christine Lee, who says is an organizer.
So under your chat box, you can see her comments, and under her comments, there's not a place for you to chat?
No. There is in questions, but not in chat.
So if you, okay, even if you click under chat, you don't see a space.
Correct.
There should be like a little arrow next to it. Okay, so do a favor for me, please. Thank you for speaking up. Can you click under your question and then type something in there?
Okay, I already typed 3 things already. I am unable to use type in chat, and others may not, and I'm just doing yes. Let me click in there. Yes. Okay. Did you just see a yes pop up?
I did not see a yes pop up. I don't know what's going on with that. Let's see. I'm sorry. I don't see that at all.
No problem. I was thinking that might be a problem others might be having.
Yeah, I'm assuming that it probably is. I don't know why it would be. I mean, it's
I
showing that
didn't want to feel unloved. I'm really enjoying this and trying to get notes on it. Will a copy of the slides be sent out to the participants?
Yes, I emailed them to Christine early this morning so she can send them to you all.
Excellent.
And I believe they're recording this as well. So if there's a recording, then I don't mind that at all.
I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you for saying that. Oh, good. Thank you. I don't know why it's not allowing. I don't know if Emma's on, and Emma can kind of try to figure out what's happening and troubleshoot a little bit. But yeah, I don't know why it's not allowing.
And like under chat now, I can see the Christina Lee, yes, it's being recorded. Mm-hmm. I've got nowhere to.
Yeah.
Okay, well, anyway.
Well, thank you so much for speaking up. I'll ask people at the end if they want to, and Christine, I don't know if we might want to do this one again or not. Bonnie is texting me saying, oh my gosh, your workshop is full. Can they increase capacity? So that was at like 9:18. Of course, I didn't see it because I was too busy yapping. So anyway, I know there are a lot of people who are emailing Steve saying, I can't get in, and I would try to email them to you if I saw them, but anyway. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving so we can get.
I'm going to mute myself. Bye now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you guys, I'm so sorry that you're, I don't know why it's not showing anything on my end that's saying that you wouldn't be able to participate. I hate that. So, I apologize for that. If you do have a question, just pipe up and ask it, and then we'll try to get through it. And if that becomes too much of a distraction, then I'll go ahead and get through the content and then ask any other questions at the end. I'm trying to explain things as clearly as possible, but sometimes you might say, well, wait a second, what about this? Or you said this, but I thought you also said that. So let's talk about writing. I'm going to try to move through these last 2 pieces at a nice clip, just so that there is time at the end for questions. Okay, so let's see. So, oh, I skipped too many slides. Okay, so let's talk about writing. So tips for writing. The first is get students to write. That's the hardest part. Almost when I first started doing professional development and adult literacy, one of the first things that people say to me is, well, I mean, I would love to teach writing, but how do I get them to write? And I honestly think getting students to write is the first step. And I think that getting students to write doesn't have to be as difficult as it sounds. Because before, whether we think about it or not, our students actually do write a lot. They write in their journals, they write letters to other people, they write out their thoughts. So you do write. They just don't like the stuff that we're giving them. So why not start with the stuff that they like? So typically, whenever I do a workshop, one of the big things I try to get people to do is to get students to either do a two-way journal. And a two-way journal is just a way for, as you're getting to know your students, a way for them to leave a thought for you and for you to leave a thought back for them. Number one, if a student is writing something to you, it starts to build rapport, which means they start to trust you with more and more of their writing, which is often necessary with writing. The other thing about a two-way journal is it gives you an opportunity to see what the student is doing. So even if they write 1 or 2 sentences, that still tells you so much information about what they know about writing. So, so what'll happen is a student might write just 1 or 2 sentences, and then you'll write a sentence back, and then they'll write 1 or 2 sentences, or maybe 3 or 4, and eventually as they start to feel more, as they get your feedback and they start to feel more comfortable, they start writing more and more and more, and then you have to put a halt on the two-way journal. But it's a way to get them started. And even if they're only writing in 2 sentences every time they write, eventually you're going to have a longer writing sample, and it still gives you something to work with when you're trying to look at the student's writing. I think with adults, because they have so much information and so many experiences, it's difficult to start with just this is a noun, this is a verb. Adults just don't learn that way. We're very constructive in our learning. We take what we know, we connect it to something else that we're going to know, and we think, do I have use for this? And if we have use for it, then we can use it and we kind of move on. Once we start turning, I think around 12, 13, our brain starts going through a process called neural pruning, and it basically starts cleaning out all the stuff that we're not using, which is why you have forgotten a lot of that stuff from back then. It is a natural process. It's a way that our brains are more efficient. We even start to ask at that time, you know, when the teachers give us something, we go, am I going to need this? Is this going to be on the test? If we don't think we're going to have a use for it, we don't bother attaching it to our frame, right? So, starting off writing by getting students to write about something they care about, and then helping them to refine that thing that they care about, to me, is like one of the most effective strategies that there is. The other thing that I think is important, which is not on the slide, is writing should always be a positive process. Our students have had so many negative experiences with writing. They have been part of the red pen brigade, where every time they get a paper from their teachers, got all these red marks on it. No one wants that kind of feedback. So usually what I'll do is I'll, instead of going through, so like let's say I'm doing a two-way journal with a student, I notice that that student is making like possessive S, plural S, apostrophe S, all kinds of errors, right? So what I'll do is I'll make a photocopy of their sheet so I can note what kinds of errors they're making, but I don't write in their journals. I mean, I'll write in their journals like, hey, you know, here's what I thought about your whatever, but I don't write corrective marks in their journal. And then I look at the types of mistakes that they're writing, and I use their writing as the context for their writing lesson. So if I ask a student to write a letter to someone who's being the most supportive to you on your GED journey, and that student writes that letter, they're going to want that letter to be in its best form by the time they give it away. So when I see it, I can say, you know what? So here's one thing that I noticed that you do, and here's how it affects your message. So like, this is important. I think it will be clearer. I think it will be more powerful. I think it will be helpful to your reader if you made this adjustment. And so I try to think of it very appreciatively and very positively so that they don't have a negative experience with it. So getting students to write, using writing as a context for their lesson. So their writing lesson doesn't come from like some worksheet, but it comes from what they actually have created themselves and how and helping to improve it. My focus again is on improving their clarity and power than on being corrective, because what I don't want is to get them to the point where they're afraid to give me more because they're afraid of the feedback that's coming from it. So I like to look at, so here's your first draft. Well, let's make another draft. There's research that talks about novice writers. And one of the things that the research says is that novice writers spend 99% of their time generating. And like no time planning, no time revising. And one of the best things that we can help our students understand is that writing, you're never done writing. That's why there are revisions and new editions of books that are published. You're never done, because there's always a different way to think about something or a different way to express it. So getting students to focus on how can we improve this? How can we make this more powerful? How can we make it more meaningful? How can we make it more colorful? Yeah, you know, and a lot of times I like to do it in a workshop setting, because then I can say, oh, I really like the way that, you know, Tony used alliteration. Can you all look at your work and think of like, how could you use alliteration? We might talk about what alliteration is and why it's, you know, why it's useful and why it's powerful or comical or what it adds. And then students can focus on how can I incorporate alliteration into the piece that I've written, and maybe they'll find a space for it and maybe not. But kind of use it as a way to explore the process of writing and to get them to enjoy the process of writing. One thing that I've noticed working with students throughout the years, during my financial literacy workshops or in adult literacy, adult learners have so much inside of them. So many of them want to share their stories. Even if they don't ever publish it, they want to write their stories. That is fertile soil for writing lessons, because if they want someone to read it, they want it to be at its absolute best, so they're willing to go back and to dig and to fight and wrestle with it. So I try to get them to focus on that too. Number 4, either focus on broad feedback or the specific feedback. Now, when I say the broad feedback, I mean like the form. If a student is responding to a prompt, did they respond to the prompt? That's broad feedback. Are they organizing? Do they have an introduction? Do they have a conclusion? Do their paragraphs follow the main idea, supporting idea structure? That broader feedback. Either focus on that or focus on the more granular type of feedback in a session. So it's not to say that you can't focus on those things all for a student, but if you're going to give students feedback, give them feedback on one thing at a time so that they can kind of digest it, take it, and go back. And honestly, as I'm saying that, I'm thinking about when I was writing my dissertation, which was like the summer from, you know, Hades. It was like my chair would I would give her a draft, and then she would give me some things to kind of grapple with, and then she would give me another draft, you know, more feedback, and then I take that feedback and go and revise and revise and revise. By the end of the summer, I didn't even want to see that thing. I was so tired of it. But if a student is writing from their heart, they're going to want that. But it's hard to get the directions on, like she would give me things like, this is your hypothesis. So now you need to focus more on your responses. And then once we got through that, it was like, okay, this says math. I want it to be mathematics. If she'd given me all of that feedback at one time, I probably would have quit. But so even for our students, it can be overwhelming to get feedback on form and feedback on the conventions of modern English. So if you notice that, even if you're looking at the high school equivalency rubrics for the essay writing, they break those out into different sections, and it's so much easier if students are able to have that feedback and without getting it all at the same time. And then try to focus on one thing that they can fix or correct at a time. It really is a lot more effective to do it that way. At the same time, whatever feedback you're giving, whether it's the broad or the narrow, make it specific enough that they can use it. So a lot of times we'll say things like, well, you know, that's good. Well, good doesn't give me anything. Good doesn't tell me how I can make it better. So you might say something like, now here's another thing that I think that I like when we do the writer's workshop. In a writer's workshop, the students are all working on a writing piece together, and you as the facilitator are a participant in the workshop. And in the workshop, the rules are that you can only give appreciative feedback, you can only give positive feedback, and you have to give that feedback in third person. So let's say Christine writes a paragraph. I might say, I like how Christine did blah, blah, blah. So if I give the feedback that specifically, like I like how Christine used this, then other students start thinking, okay, so that was a good thing. Maybe I can figure out how to use that too. And they're more motivated to use that. But then because my feedback is specific, they can actually put that into action. If I just say things like, well, I think that you did a good job of describing your ideas, that doesn't help them. But if I say, you know, you included facts, you included opinions, you included data, you included some citations, like all of those things that feedback helps them. Or if you say, Yeah, it's like when you say to someone, "Oh, good job," like, well, what was good about the job? You know, what specifically did I do well that I should repeat, or what didn't I do well and should eliminate from my strategies? So make your feedback specific enough for the student to use, whether you're focusing on broad writing issues or the narrower, more specific writing issues. And then the most important thing I would say is to look at patterns and student errors. And this actually kind of goes along with earlier today. I said there are two things if you don't remember anything else. The first one is to think about how students are thinking. So this is part of that thinking about what they're thinking, having knowledge of their thinking. So if you look at the patterns in the students' errors, it tells you so much. But here's what's cool. I'm going to put this on the board, and I want you all to look at this reading. Okay, so I want you to think about looking for patterns in writing errors. I'm going to read it. My mother is the person who motivates me the most. She always has been in my corner. Even when I mess up, she continues to give me love and support. I know that when I finish my GED, she'll be proud of me. She showed me how to be responsible, how to keep going when I'm feeling like giving up. She never makes me feel bad about myself like some people do. Okay? Everybody get a chance to look at that? All right, so this next slide are some of the errors that are in this passage, right? And one thing that I noticed is that here at the end of motivates, have and has, it should be has. Here there's an S, here there's an S. So here the student has basically 5 errors on this page, right? But if I look at her errors, I can pay attention to the fact that these 4 errors are actually 1 error, but it's the same, she repeats it over and over and over in every sentence, right? So the error is that this student is struggling with noun-verb agreement. So we know if you've ever taken a foreign language, you have conjugated verbs, right? And so in English, we do the same thing. We say, I go, you go, but he goes, right? So a lot of times students don't know those rules, that noun-verb agreement, which verb form goes with which noun. And I'll tell you that this is more common in African-American students, for sure, largely because when the slaves were free, well, first of all, when the slaves were here, they were not actually taught standard English. They kind of had to put together things based on their own languages and what little bit of English they picked up. And then secondly, because when the slaves were freed, not everyone had the opportunity to go away to education, and we learn language orally. So we learn what we hear. So if our mom says, she go, then we will say she go. And until someone tells us that it's she goes, then we don't understand the pattern. The pattern is I go, you go, we go, they go, but he, she, or it goes, right? So, and I always try to get my students to understand that. So here's the thing though, if I teach my student that rule, if I teach my student that rule, one rule will correct just these 4 errors in one tiny little piece of a paragraph, right? So you might look at a student's writing sample and see tons of errors, but if you really look for those patterns, you'll see that they really are only making 2 or 3 errors. They're just making that same error over and over again. So look how much do you think we could improve a student's writing if they struggle with noun-verb agreement? If we fix that 1 error, we'll touch almost every sentence that they write. So it's important to look for those patterns. And if you're teaching in like a whole class setting, what I would do is I would have all of my students do a writing sample, and I would look at what kinds of errors they're making. I would note those kinds of errors, and I would track data. Like there are tons of noun-verb agreement. There are lots of possessive and plural S confusion. There's lots of apostrophe use. But there are a couple of run-on sentences. I would look at what's the biggest problem in my class, and that would be the thing that I would focus on in the writing samples first for everybody. And then as students then what happens is your class starts to become better and better and better on the things that they were the worst at, right? So you're able to address the biggest problem the quickest. Okay, so that's one strategy that I like to use. I even use that with my master's students, looking back at the writing strategies, getting students to write, using their writing as the context for improving their writing, focusing on improving their clarity and power rather than on correcting, which makes it more positive and appreciative. Choosing either broad feedback or narrow feedback, making the feedback specific enough that they can do something about it, and then looking for those patterns. Those are the writing strategies. So I want you to just think about one of those strategies that you think you could implement, and just write a little note that, you know, with the next student that you're working with, I'm going to try using one of these tools. All right. I'll give you just a beat there, and then I'll move on to the map. I hope I'm not talking too fast for you all. I know I talk fast. I think it helps make people pay attention. But if I'm talking to yourself and go, whoa, sister, slow it down a little bit. You're probably thinking, fine time to tell us now, Carmen. Okay, so strategies for numeracy development. We are rounding third and heading home, guys. So thanks for hanging in here with me. Okay, so math tips. There are two that are highlighted, but I'll probably go into a little bit more detail on more than those two. So the first is, don't assume numeric literacy. And numeric literacy is just like is a student's ability to take numbers in writing, to understand numerical information, to be able to process that information, and then to be able to use it for something. So for example, if I am looking at a nutrition label and I see that it's 210 calories per serving, and I know that there are 2 servings, automatically I know in my mind that they're 420 calories per serving. That's numeric literacy. Or to be able to look at a medicine bottle and say, okay, so my kid is this old and she weighs this much, and I can have a half teaspoon per 20 pounds, and she's, you know, to help me, how do I use that information? Looking at a bill and figuring out what's the best service plan for your money. All of that is considered numeric literacy. It's not math in isolation, it's math within a context. And our students need to learn how to develop math within a context. If a student is doing a word problem, that's numeric literacy. The mathematics is the actual calculation. The numeric literacy is understanding that here's what this problem's about, and here's what they're asking me to do. So since they're asking me to do that, then I need this concept. So what we really need to do is not assume that students have that understanding in that number sense. I shared a story before about a student who was not super clear on even in odd numbers, and having to take a moment and help her understand that, you know, if I have even numbers, if I split them in half, each one of those members in that group is going to have a mate. But if I have an odd number, somebody's going to be the oddball, someone's going to be left out. Or to say to her that anytime a number ends in 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8, it's going to be an even number. But if it ends in 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, it's an odd number. So all of these like little things that it's very easy to take for granted that an adult would know it. We cannot assume that numeric literacy, because sometimes our students don't know what they don't know. They don't know what questions to ask. They're just trying to follow along with what we're giving them. So having those conversations with them is really, really critical. I'm going to share a story about one of our tutors at Seeds of Literacy, who I absolutely adore, because his name is Ed Round. People hear me talk about him all the time. They're probably sick of hearing about it, but he is just so open to anything that will help a student. So he was working with a student recently, and that student was working on division. And as the student was working on division, he was working with the student. He'd been working together for like a month or so, and he said, yeah, we're still working on division. And I thought, well, why are you still working on division after a month? Like, what is it that he's not getting? And so I asked him, I said, well, you know, tell me what this is about. And he didn't know what division was about. Like, he couldn't explain to me what division actually was or why we would use it. So you can't assume that a student understands that because they're an adult. And I mean, Ed took that little nugget and ran with it, and ended up helping us to come up with a professional development session that we did called Dirt Plus Water equals Mud. And I'll get into that in a little bit in a moment. But it was just figuring out what the student's struggle was. The struggle is he didn't understand the concept. So he was doing calculations, he was completing worksheets, but didn't really understand. So we don't want to assume that they have this level of literacy that they don't have. Second, the second tip is to go from concrete to semi-concrete to abstract. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit greater detail in a moment. So I'm going to skip over it for a moment. Third, clearly define vocabulary. And when I talk about defining vocabulary, it's not just the terms, but it's also the symbols of mathematics. Because sometimes we make the assumption that our students understand the symbols, and they don't necessarily. And so one of the struggles that one of our students at Seeds was having with division was that he didn't know that the division sign meant divide by. He didn't understand that. Sometimes students don't know that the fraction bar is actually another form of the division sign. So we have to be clear about defining math vocabulary. I think that students should have a math dictionary and like create their own math dictionary so that they understand what is a fraction, what is a numerator, what does the denominator represent, what is an improper fraction, what is a mixed number. If students don't have understanding of that vocabulary, the math problems are going to be a puzzle. They're going to be confusing. So making sure that they understand the vocabulary is a critical part of math that I think sometimes people gloss over just because, you know, we tend to assume that that foundation is there. And for some students, that foundation is there, but we want to make sure that we're bringing every student along so we're not replicating the failure of our public school system with our adult learners. So not assuming numeric literacy, moving from concrete to semi-concrete to abstract, which we'll go deeper into in a moment, clearly defining vocabulary. The fourth is don't be afraid to use manipulatives. Manipulatives is an education term for toys, quite honestly. And they're not necessarily toys, but manipulatives are anything that students can get their hands on and touch to help understand math learning. So in front of you on your screen, there are three Lego blocks, 3 blocks of Lego blocks that are connected. So three Legos connected, and there are 3 sets of those. And one thing that using those manipulatives does is it helps students to actually be able to visibly picture math, because math is actually very abstract. It's like these numbers don't necessarily have to mean anything. They could be, you know, in fact, it's very abstract because sometimes we use letters even in our math, right? And sometimes that letter X is a variable, and sometimes that letter X is a multiplication symbol. Please really be clear that students understand what it is that we want them to do. So using manipulatives kind of helps to make the math physical for them. It makes it more concrete, and it makes it easier for them to see and manipulate, and it makes it easier for them to get from confusion to, oh, okay, I kind of get it, right? We'll go into more detail with that in a moment. I'll go to number 6, which is helping to develop fluency. And so when I talk about fluency in reading, it's how smoothly students are able to read words. When I talk about fluency in math, it's how smoothly a student is able to move between concepts in mathematics. I think the worst thing that adult education publishers do is they treat each math topic like it's separate. They teach addition as one thing, and then they teach subtraction as something completely different, and they don't really connect how addition and subtraction are related. But if you think about addition and subtraction, we call them opposites, or we call them inverse operations, right? I start using the term inverse operations as soon as we start talking about subtraction. Because if a student can understand that addition is if 1 plus 2 is 3, and 3 minus 2 is 1, that those are inverse operations or opposite operations, then students understanding their math facts comes a lot easier. If they feel like they have to memorize all the addition facts and then memorize all the subtraction facts, that is awesome. But if you tell them, if you memorize the addition facts, you'll already know the subtraction facts because they're inverse operations. That can be really, really helpful. And one student that I'm working with right now who really is struggling with that number sense, it is helping her a lot to be able to think about that a little bit differently. Another thing that I'm doing with her is if she's doing a flashcard, say she's doing 9 plus 5, I get her to think about, I'm trying to get her to do more mental math, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but a lot of that too is helping her to understand that addition and subtraction are connected, and the same way that addition and subtraction are connected, multiplication and division are connected, okay? So we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. Number 7, Number 7, making math relevant. So we already talked about the fact that math is kind of abstract. It's kind of out there. It's kind of like a intellectual exercise, right? At least it is when it's on the paper. But when you're talking about your money, when you're talking about losing weight, when you're talking about keeping your diabetic numbers in check, those numbers make a lot more sense and have a lot more meaning. So a lot of times I will use math, I will use money in math because students will get that. So let's take, for example, the student who was struggling with the idea of division. When we asked him, you know, so what does division mean, or what do you understand? Why would we use division? And he said, you know what, sugar, I don't know, right? So I said, this was in December. So I said, well, you know, Christmas is coming. How many grandchildren do you have? And he said, I got 11 grandkids. And I'm like, oh, that's marvelous. And I said, well, how much money, if I can ask, are you planning to spend, or just throw out a number, even if it's not true? How much money do you plan to spend for your 11 grandkids for Christmas? And so he gave me an amount. And I said, well, if we want to make sure that each one of your grandkids gets the same amount, an equal amount, if we want to be fair, if we want to give each one the same amount, then we have to use division. And so, so I asked him about that, and we were trying to get him to learn how to use the addition tables and the subtraction tables. And when we were doing that, we were really struggling because he wasn't understanding the idea that if 1 + 2 = 3, then 3 + 2 = 1. And the reason for that is that's still an abstract concept. Even though it sounds like basic math, it's still very abstract. So what we talked about to get him to understand that is we talked about the fact that if I have a pile of dirt and I add some water, I'm going to get mud. But if the sun comes out and bakes that mud and all the water is subtracted out through evaporation, I'm going to be left again with just dirt, right? So we got him to think that if dirt plus water equals mud, if I take the water out of mud, I'm going to get dirt. That's what helped him be able to picture that if 2 + 6 is 8, then 8 - 6 is 2. And because of that, we were also able to get him to use multiplication tables to learn division facts, because if 2 × 4 is 8, then 8 divided by 4 = 2. So we really focused on vocabulary. We really focused on making sure he understood all of the symbols for addition, division, subtraction. And keep in mind, multiplication has so many different ways. So you have to make sure the students understand all of the different ways that multiplication can be represented. When we talk about fluency, that's part of it. So in the beginning, when we're teaching 1 + 2 = blank, sometimes we might represent that with a blank. Sometimes we might represent that blank with a question mark. Sometimes we might represent that blank with a variable. So the students are starting to learn about algebra when they're learning about addition. So then when those variables are introduced in algebra, it's not like this new freaky thing. They've already been working with variables. That's the fluency. So I'm helping students to see certain concepts throughout every single topic in math, and I'm helping them to see how they're related. How is addition related to subtraction? What is that relationship? How are multiplication and addition alike? Multiplication is repeated addition. 2 + 2 + 2 is 3 × 2. So helping students to understand that, even with manipulatives, can be really helpful. If they see that division is, I'm taking away 2, I'm taking away 2, I'm taking away 2, that, yeah, that actually is subtraction. I'm just subtracting the same, I'm subtracting groups. That's what division is. So once students get a better understanding of that, I think the other area I think that is, you know, students will come in and go, oh God, if I get to those fractions. And fractions is like the biggest puzzle to students. But I think the reason fractions is the biggest puzzle is because we don't do this. We assume numeric literacy. We get that they already have an understanding of it, and they don't. We don't start from concrete to semi-concrete to abstract, which we'll talk about more in a minute. I realize I haven't gone into that yet. We don't help them understand what the numerator is. They don't know what the denominator is. We don't necessarily give them the clues to help them understand that, like, we can say that D, the denominator, is down, you know, or like there's so many different clues that you can give students to help them try to keep those straight. A lot of times the confusion that students have is that when they learn that, no one helped them straighten out which one was which. And so it's like when you're thinking of principal and principal, right? Do you remember which one is which? And then you go, oh, well, your principal is your pal, right? So then you remember anytime you're not talking about your pal, you're talking about principal with a PLE. So just like that, sometimes students just have math things that they didn't have a chance to sort out or didn't have a tool for sorting out. So if we can give them that, then it'll help them with their understanding, and it'll also help them with remembering that content. So helping students to develop that fluency is making sure that like we don't keep these topics siloed, because they're not siloed. They're fluid. And 8 is the same as 16 divided by 2. It's the same as 8 times 1. It's the same times 8 plus 0. It's the same times 32 divided by 2, or 32 divided by 4, I'm sorry, or 32 8. So it's like helping them to see that that number is so many things. It's just ways that we represent these quantities, right? So helping students develop fluency, making math relevant, again, using math, using money. Money definitely helps with decimals and percents. Finance is just a really ripe topic, a really rich topic for math. And then incorporating mental math. So I like to help students to try to think about ways to do math in their heads, because sometimes mental math methods are just quicker. So for example, I should have put this in the presentation. I didn't think about that. But so for example, one of the students that I'm working with now, we teach reading from left to right, right? But then we teach math from right to left. But I've been teaching her math concepts, mental math concepts from left to right, because I'm trying to help her understand place value and to maintain place value. But also I want her to understand that conceptually, that she's combining different sets of numbers. So in other words, if I give her, and take a little departure here, I'm sorry, this was not planned, but I want her to understand. Can you all see this with me? I want her to understand that, oh, you can't see it, okay. I want her to understand that 428, it's 400 plus 20 plus 8. In her mind, I need her to understand that that 2 always stands for 20, even if, whether it's separate or not. And so what I'm doing is I'm having her do mental math addition with 3-digit numbers. So she can add 427 plus 420 plus 529. She adds her, like, so I don't remember what numbers I gave you. So if she's adding 427 plus 513, for example, she's going to add 427 plus 500, and she gets 927 right away. Then she knows that 10 more just takes it to the 100. She knows that it adds to that, and then she adds the ones. So she can do mental math faster than she can do written math, going from left. She can do mental math from left to right faster than she can do written math from right to left, because it's helping her understand the concept of hundreds being consistent, the concept of tens being consistent, and that when she has more tens than she can hold in tens place, it increases her hundreds. So her math is getting a lot faster, her calculations are getting a lot faster mentally, which she's going to need to pass the ASVAB. So incorporating mental math can be really helpful, helping them to think about how to think about math. Another thing that she'll do is she'll say, if she's trying to add, say, 9 plus 14, or 9 plus 4, I'll say, well, that 9 is going to take 1 away from, like, if that 9, to make that 9 a 10, you have to take 1 away from the 3, and then you already know how to add your 10s to everything. So 10 plus 3 is going to always be 13. 10 plus 4 is always going to be 14. 10 plus 5 is always going to be 15. So if I have 9 and 6, and I make that 9 a 10, I know I have 5 left. The answer has to be 15. And she is getting really sharp and really quick with that. Like in the beginning, she was like, oh, I see what you're doing. And now it's just like automatic, and she runs with it. So incorporating mental math can be really helpful. So let's talk about concrete to semi-concrete to abstract and develop conceptual understanding. Then I'll open for questions, and I'll let you guys go and enjoy your Friday. So concrete is starting with something that students can actually wrap their minds around, something that they have experience with, something that they can physically touch. You can use pennies, you can use counters, you can use coins, you can use rulers, you can use die, you can use playing cards, you can use any food, any number of things that students can touch, wrap their hands around, wrap their minds around to represent math in a concrete way. So pizza is the most famous example for fractions. I'm sorry. Pizza is the most common example for fractions. And what we're trying to get students to understand, and I think that, so let me say this too. From the time students start working with numbers, they're working with whole numbers, right? So we get 3 plus 5 is 8, and 8 is the number, the total that's in the whole. Then we go to fractions, and instead of getting them to look at whole groups of things, we start looking at just a piece of a thing, but we never explain to students that the game has changed. We don't get them to understand that these numbers are fractions because they are smaller than one whole. And what else is smaller than one whole? A decimal. And what else is smaller than a whole? A percent. So helping students to make those connections across topics from the very beginning. But so starting out with the concrete example for fractions is we took this pizza and we divided it into 8 pieces. And then helping them to understand that the denominator is the number of pieces in the whole, and it goes on the bottom. And a lot of times what I'll say to students is, I'll ask them if, like, are you a person of faith? And yes, if they are, then I'll say, well, what's your denomination? And I'll say, well, your denomination, it's your base, it's your foundation, right? It's what you build on. So that helps them to remember that their denomination is the bottom of the fraction. Or I'll say D, denominator D for down, and they remember that that is the number that's on the bottom. So I get them to think about the number of pieces that are in this pizza. And a lot of times, you have the little foam pizzas that are cut out so the students can actually manipulate them, because you wouldn't want them touching all over an actual pizza. But giving them something that they can handle and manipulate, and that can kind of focus their thinking. So when they see that I have 8 pieces in the whole and that I have a whole pizza, even though it's divided into 8, then they understand that when there are 8 pieces missing, so I'll teach that the number of pieces missing or the number of pieces that remain are the numbers that's in the numerator. And what I'll say is a numerator number is a number that we care about. And sometimes we care about the number that's gone. Sometimes we care about the number that's left. If you're trying to figure out, how much you ate, you might want to look at how much is gone, right? Because if you haven't eaten, you want to know how much is left, right? So, or if you're planning leftovers, right? That's my life. Anyway, so the numerator is the number of pieces that are either missing or the number of pieces that are gone. So I'll try to have the students look at that pizza and ask how many pieces are missing. Well, if no pieces are missing, then I'm just going to say the number of pieces missing are 0, and that's here in the middle. And what I'm trying to get them to understand is the concept of the number of pieces missing goes on top, and the number of pieces missing goes on the bottom. Now here in the middle here, I'm semi-concrete because they get that they're a number of pieces, but I'm trying to make it a little bit mathematics. I'm putting it in the mathematic frame, even though I'm still using words that they can connect to the number of pieces of pizza that are on the plate. So I've gone from concrete to semi-concrete to the actual abstract representation of this fraction. 0 pieces are missing out of the 8 pieces in the whole pizza. So I'm really trying to help students go from concrete to semi-concrete to abstract. That works for fractions. It can also work for decimals. If you want to use it for decimals, you would just make sure that your denominator is always a multiple of 10, right? So out of 10s or out of 100s or out of 1,000. That's all that decimals are. They're fractions with a denominator that is a factor of 10. So if I'm defining this math vocabulary, if I'm talking to students about math vocabulary, and even if we're talking about even if we're talking about a topic that we haven't gotten to yet, I like to try to introduce some of the concepts earlier so that when they get to this new topic, it's like, oh, well, yeah, I already dealt with that already when we were talking about this. So helping students go from concrete to semi-concrete abstract, and that works for operations as well. Get some pennies or counters and help students understand that if I have 2 objects and I add 6 more objects, I have 8 objects. That if I take those same 8 objects and I take away 3, I have 5. One thing that I'll do is have students just kind of play around with those, like how many combinations of 8 can you come up with? Sometimes they'll come up with 1 and 7, and 2 and 6, and 3 and 5, and 4 and 4. Every once in a while, somebody will come up with 0 and 8, and that's great. I want them to be thinking about math that expansively. But the idea is to get them to take something that they can wrap their hands around, to get them to represent it almost mathematically before we only ask them to work on math. Typically what happens, so in terms of how students learn, we are concrete first, and then we go to semi-concrete and then to abstract, right? And when we were younger, we saw things, we took things very literally because we were concrete thinkers, right? When I was younger, I used to love Amelia Bedelia books because she took everything so literally. She was so concrete in her thinking that she was hilarious. But then as I got older, then my thinking started to become more abstract as well. And I didn't necessarily have to be able to see something in front of me to be able to figure out how to manipulate it or to understand it, right? Or we start to understand concepts like democracy or whatever. So like our thinking becomes more abstract, but we still are concrete people. We're still concrete in our thinking, in our cognition. So helping students start from concrete to semi-concrete abstract can be really helpful. And here's the other thing. If you give students time to kind of play around with the math, what starts to happen is, so one thing that we have to our advantage if we're not struggling with math is that we had time to discover some of these relationships. And because we've discovered some of those relationships, like any number plus 0 is going to equal itself, the identity property, we're able to take that knowledge and information for granted. So it's nice to give students time to kind of play around with these because they start to understand and discover some of those relationships for themselves, which makes it easier for them to remember, because it's easier to remember something that you've had the experience of, right? And so it's a good strategy to use. So concrete to semi-concrete to abstract. With the student who I've been working with who's really, really struggling with her math facts, I asked her I said, I want you to write out the plus ones. 1 plus 1, 1 plus 2, 1 plus 3. I said, I just want you to write all of those out, just those, and just practice those until I talk to you again. And so she did that. And when I talked to her again, she said, you know what, when I did that, I noticed there was a pattern. Like, yes, that's exactly what math learning is, figuring out those relationships and patterns. So I want her to grapple with that a little bit. And I think that's one of the things that our tutors who are starting to use those manipulatives more and more in the classroom, I think they're beginning to get that. Number one, the students don't care that you're using the manipulatives as long as they're understanding what it is that you're asking them to do. They're really okay with it. I know some people are like, oh, well, you know, they're adults. Adults don't care. Adults want to understand. And if those manipulatives help them understand, they don't care what other people think about it. So definitely think about that, because those manipulatives really help us to have that go from concrete to semi-concrete to abstract. And then I think this is my last actual content slide. No, it isn't. I have 2 more. So when I'm developing conceptual understanding, so here's another example of developing conceptual understanding. So if I take 1/4 away from this pile, that's considered subtraction, right? And if I take another 1/4 away, that's also subtraction, right? But what happens if I take 4 quarters at a time, or $1? If I take out $1 or 4 quarters at a time, is that also subtraction? Yes, it is. It's also subtraction, but it's subtraction of same size groups. So as long as I take out 4 every single time, then that subtraction can be represented as a division problem. So whenever I start with a student on division, I start out first with subtraction, because if they can understand subtracting 1, then they can understand subtracting more than 1. So I might not have coins. Maybe that day we have cookies, and I say, okay, so here's 5 cookies. If I take 2 cookies at a time, am I still subtracting cookies? Yes, I'm subtracting groups of 2. That is called division. So the 2 factors in a division problem are the number of groups and the number of members in a group, but it is still subtraction. Okay, so it's just kind of a way to help them to understand how subtraction and multiplication work together, how subtraction and division are related to one another. Is kind of try to help to develop that fluidity, that fluency between the different math concepts. And then the last example that I'm going to use is with fractions and helping students understand a couple concepts with fractions. The first is that understanding equivalent fractions. So if a student can understand that if you can show them, so say for example, if we had both of these filled in on this circle, if the student could see that and see that that is, if these 2 were both filled in, they would see that 2/4 is the same as this 1/2. So being able to visualize those different fractions is a concept that I think is really important to emphasize in fractions. And another concept that students often miss in fractions is that, so the denominator is the number of pieces in the whole. We said that, right? So if the number of pieces in the whole is the denominator, then the denominator for this one will be 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and so on, right? One thing that's important for students to understand is that the bigger the denominator, the smaller your share, right? So I'll ask them, like, would you rather that we split this pizza in 2, or would you rather that we have to share it between 10 people, and they'll go, oh, I would rather it just be the two of us, right? So I want them to understand that concept that the larger the denominator gets, the more pieces this thing is divided into, which means the less we actually get, the smaller it actually is. So just some things to kind of demonstrate that conceptual understanding is really, really the most important piece of math learning. If they can do all of the steps, but they don't have the conceptual understanding, they're still not going to do well in math, because if you present a problem to them a different way, they don't know what to do with it. I've actually seen students who've done problems vertically, but if you gave them the same problems horizontally, they were like, well, what am I supposed to do with that, right? In fact, I did that with a student that I'm working with on the mental math, and I gave her problems horizontally, and she was like, so I'm still looking for the hundreds, right? Yes, you're still looking for the hundreds, and then you're gonna look for the tens, and then you're gonna look for the ones. And it's clicking for her that way. So this is actually the end of my slideshow, but I want to go back to the list of math concepts really quickly, just as a review. So don't assume numeric literacy. Try to take your teaching progression from something concrete that they can wrap their hands around, like the manipulatives, to something that's semi-concrete, which is kind of a representation of the manipulatives, to the abstract, which is math. Clearly define math vocabulary in their words. You can use examples and non-examples again. So like this would be the numerator, this would not be the numerator. Don't be afraid to use manipulatives. Don't be afraid to play, to explore, to discover. The relationships that are going to be the most important in math are the relationships that students discover on their own, because they're the ones they're most likely to remember. Help students develop that conceptual understanding. Help them develop that fluency between concepts. Two very good tools for helping to develop that fluency is, oh darn, I forgot what I was going to say. Well, I know the number line is one of them. So if you put a number line and just put 0 to 10 this direction, and you start working with students and you just add that number line, you show them how to do addition on the number line. If I have 3 on the number line and I add 2 more, I'm hopping to 5, right? So the number line is a great tool because you can use a number line for addition. You can use it to demonstrate subtraction. You can use it to show multiplication because they're groups, adding in groups. You can use it to show division. You can use it to show that decimals and fractions are between each one of those numbers on the number line. You can use it to show integers. There's so many different things that we can use with the number line, and we use number line in addition, and then we let it go. Keep it and just show students how they're building that knowledge more and more and more, and how all these pieces kind of fit together. And then last, try to find a way to make math relevant for your students. Okay, so those are the ends of my slides. I would like to have time for people to ask questions. So if you want to unmute and ask a question, since we don't have our chat feature. Again, you're all going to get a copy of the recording. You're also going to get a copy. I can't see anybody sitting through this twice, but if you want to share it with someone, that would be great. And then my contact information is here. And last, you're going to get a copy of the slideshow as well, so you'll have, that opportunity there. So if there are any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. And Christine is also going to email the evaluation to you, so please fill that out. They use that to inform their funders. I've heard her give this speech enough times, I should be able to tell you this. They use it to tell their funders about, what people are getting out of the workshops that they're paying for. It actually helps me because they give me the feedback as well. So it helps me to know what was useful or what I should leave out the next time. So if you could also complete those evaluations, that would be really, really great. And the last thing I would say is if you are not, you're going to be getting information about another event that's coming up in May. It is the Literacy Learning Network's event about civic engagement, like how to engage with your legislators, why you should be involved in the census, why your vote matters. We're going to hear from local, state, and national presenters about ways that we and our students can be involved. So you can register on the Literacy Cooperative website. Christine will also send you certificates. So all of those announcements. If there's anything else, Christine, please put in the chat. But other than that, if there are any questions, please feel free to chime in. No questions. Any comments? I'm so used to having an amen corner, and you guys are so quiet. You're all still here. I can see that or at least your computers are still here, even if your bodies are gone. All right. Well, if there aren't any questions, then I'm going to go ahead and let you all go to your Friday. This was actually, I don't know how I would have done this if you had participated to the extent that I wanted to, because I am almost to my time. So thank you so much. I hope that you find some of these strategies useful. If you do use one, I would love to hear your stories about what you're doing with your students and how they took to some of the strategies or any other ideas that you've come up with that I might share in a future training. Please feel free to reach out to me. And outside of that, have a great Friday. Thanks so much for sharing this morning with me. I enjoyed it. Bye.